Close your eyes, take a deep breath, and imagine the soft rustling of leaves in a distant mountain valley. The air is cool, yet filled with the faintest trace of something fragrant. In the far mists of history, long before tea became a drink known across the world, there was China. It was here, in the quiet hills of Yunnan, that the story of tea began. According to legend, tea was discovered thousands of years ago by the Chinese Emperor Shennong. He was said to be a scholar of plants, a ruler who wandered the countryside, studying herbs and their effects on the human body. The tale goes that one day, as he sat beneath a wild tea tree with a pot of boiling water nearby, several leaves drifted down from above and landed in the steaming pot. The water slowly changed its color, releasing a delicate aroma. Shennong tasted it, and in that moment, he is said to have discovered tea. Whether or not this legend is true hardly matters. What matters is the image it gives us. A quiet figure, seated beneath tall trees, tasting for the first time the warm comfort of tea. In the stillness of that imagined scene, we feel the beginning of something timeless, something that will spread across empires and centuries, yet always remain a simple act of pouring, sipping, and sharing. The earliest uses of tea in China were not as a daily beverage in the way we know it today. Instead, tea was treated as a medicinal herb. In its rawest form, leaves were chewed, brewed, or blended with other ingredients to create infusions thought to cleanse the body and sharpen the mind. Ancient Chinese medical texts mention tea as a way to relieve fatigue, clear the head, and aid in digestion. It was not only a drink but a healing companion. As dynasties rose and fell, tea found a place in the rituals of daily life. During the 10th dynasty, which began in the 7th century, tea drinking became more refined. No longer was it only for medicinal use. It became a social act, a part of gatherings, and eventually a marker of culture. The poet Lu Ju, often called the Sage of Tea, wrote the first great book on tea, known as the Shajing, or the Classic of Tea. This work described everything from the types of tea leaves, to the ideal ways of preparing water, to the vessels best suited for brewing. In his calm, detailed writing, we sense the transformation of tea from a simple plant into an art form. Imagine the 10th dynasty tea gatherings. Quiet and gentle, tea was often prepared by grinding the leaves into a fine powder, mixing them with hot water, and whisking them into a frothy bowl. Guests sat in courtyards or gardens, savoring the flavor while poetry was recited and music softly played. To drink tea was to enter into a moment of peace, a pause in the flow of the world, where conversation and reflection could blossom. During the Song Dynasty, which followed, the tea culture evolved further. Tea competitions were held, where participants compared the color and froth of their whisked tea, admiring the subtle shades of green and white that danced upon the surface. The act of preparing tea became almost like painting or calligraphy, precise, deliberate, and graceful. The tea bowls themselves were treasured works of art, glazed in deep colors that made the pale tea stand out in contrast. This period also gave birth to the art of tea preparation that would later influence Japan's famous tea ceremony. Monks carried tea seeds and traditions from China to Japan, where they took root and transformed into a new cultural practice. But still, the heart of the ritual remained the same: to sit, to brew, and to share. By the time of the Ming Dynasty, beginning in the 14th century, a change occurred. Instead of whisking powdered tea, people began to steep whole leaves in hot water, a method more familiar to us today. This shift allowed the natural flavors and aromas of the leaves to shine more clearly, without the froth and grinding. The simplicity of steeping leaves in water brought tea even closer to everyday life. Delicate teapots made of porcelain or clay became common, and the art of crafting teaware grew alongside the art of tea itself. Picture a Ming household in the early morning. A small clay pot is set upon the table. Water is boiled with care, then poured gently over the leaves, which slowly unfurl, releasing their fragrance into the room. The sound of the water, the sight of steam rising, the quiet patience of waiting, all of it is part of the experience. Family members or guests gather, not for haste or indulgence, but for the calm rhythm of drinking together. In such moments, tea was more than a drink. It was a language of connection, a way of sharing silence as much as conversation. The Qing Dynasty, which followed, saw tea become a symbol of Chinese identity and culture. Tea houses opened in cities, where travelers, scholars, merchants, and workers could sit together, sip, and talk. In these spaces, tea was not only for the elite, but for everyone. A tea house might be filled with lively chatter, the clatter of cups, the aroma of different brews, and the slow unfolding of daily life, tea had become democratic, a part of the public fabric of China. Through all these centuries, one thing remained constant: the act of boiling water, preparing leaves, and savoring the taste. Tea was always about more than flavor. It was about slowing down, noticing details, and finding comfort in the ordinary. As we close this first chapter of our journey, let us rest on this thought. Somewhere thousands of years ago, a man sat beneath a tree, and in the rising steam of a simple brew, an entire world of tradition was born. Imagine, if you will, the long and winding paths of the Silk Road. Not a single road, but a vast network of trade routes, stretching across deserts, mountains, and great rivers, linking the heart of China with lands as far away as Persia, Arabia, and Europe. Caravans moved slowly along these paths, lines of camels, their soft steps pressing into the sand, merchants guiding them patiently, and bales of silk, spices, and porcelain packed neatly upon their backs. Among these goods, tea began to travel. At first, it was carried in small amounts, something precious, almost exotic, bundled tightly into compressed bricks. Tea was easy to transport and lasted the long journeys without spoiling. These bricks of tea could be stacked neatly, packed alongside silk rolls and jars of spice, moving westward toward new lands. Tea was not only a drink on the Silk Road. In some regions, it became a form of currency. Traders in Central Asia, Tibet, and Mongolia sometimes exchanged tea bricks in place of coins. A brick of tea could be broken apart, brewed, or used in trade, giving it both practical and symbolic value. To hold a brick of tea in your hands was to hold warmth, nourishment, and wealth, all at once. Now, let us pause and imagine the caravans resting at night. The fire glows softly under the desert stars. Water is heated, and into it a piece of tea brick is dropped. Slowly, it softens and dissolves, releasing a bitter yet invigorating taste. For weary travelers, this was not only comfort, but energy, a way to continue through the cold nights and long marches ahead. In this way, tea became a companion to the Silk Road itself, moving step by step with merchants and explorers across vast distances. In Tibet, tea took on a unique and distinctive form. There, high in the mountains, where the air was thin and the cold was constant, people did not drink tea as a simple infusion. Instead, they boiled tea with butter, often from yak milk, and added salt. The result was butter tea, thick, nourishing, and warming, perfect for the harsh climate of the plateau. To visitors, the taste might seem unusual, even strange. But for Tibetans, butter tea was life-giving, a daily sustenance as well as a symbol of hospitality. To share a bowl of butter tea was to welcome a guest into the heart of the home. In Mongolia, too, tea found a special place. Here, it was often boiled with milk and sometimes with flour or rice, creating a hearty drink that blurred the line between tea and meal. For nomadic peoples, always moving across vast open steppes, tea was not merely a luxury, but an essential part of survival. As tea moved further along the Silk Road, it reached Persia, where the culture of gardens, poetry, and conversation gave it a new stage. Persian traders and nobles admired the drink, not only for its flavor, but for the way it fit into their traditions of hospitality. In time, Persia would develop its own strong tea culture, but the seeds were planted here, in these first encounters with the leaves that traveled out of China. All along these routes, tea was adapting, changing, and reshaping itself according to local needs and customs. It was no longer just Chinese tea. It was Tibetan butter tea, Mongolian milk tea, Persian spice tea. Each culture took the leaves and poured them into its own vessel, blending them with its own traditions, until tea became not one thing, but many. By the Tang dynasty, the Chinese empire itself encouraged these exchanges. Tea was traded not only for silver and horses, but as part of diplomacy. Gifts of fine tea were sent to neighboring rulers, tokens of goodwill and power. To receive tea from China was to receive a symbol of refinement and status. Imagine a Persian envoy returning home with boxers of Chinese porcelain, silks, and carefully packed bundles of tea leaves, treasures to be displayed and savored before kings and courts. But it was not only material wealth that traveled with tea. Ideas traveled to the culture of tea, its poetry, its philosophy, its teaness spread with it. Alongside silk and spices, the notion of tea as a calming, reflective act moved across continents, quietly influencing the way people thought about rest, hospitality, and ritual. Picture for a moment the bustling trading post of Samarkand, in Central Asia. Merchants from China, India, Persia, and Arabia meet here, speaking in many tongues, exchanging goods under the shade of colorful tents. Somewhere in this mingling of voices, a pot of tea is poured. The steam rises, bridging cultures and silence, even as languages differ. In that small act, we glimpse the unspoken power of tea, the ability to connect strangers, to soothe fatigue, and to create a shared pause in the endless motion of trade. Over time, tea's journey along the Silk Road paved the way for its spread even further. The routes that carried silk and porcelain westward would eventually carry tea to Russia and the Middle East, and from there to Europe. But at this stage, tea was still something rare, something to be marveled at, treasured, and slowly woven into the fabric of daily life. As you rest, now consider this. Every sip of tea we drink today carries within it the memory of those ancient caravans, the soft steps of camels, under the stars the glowing embers of campfires, and the hands that passed bricks of tea across deserts and mountains. Tea was never only about taste. It was about endurance, connection, and the quiet comfort of warmth shared in unfamiliar lands. Let us continue our journey with calm and unhurried steps. From the busy trade routes of the Silk Road, tea's influence spread in many directions, but one of its most profound journeys was across the sea, from China to Japan. Imagine a small vessel, its sails rising against the waves, carrying with it not only monks and travelers, but also books, seeds, and leaves. Among these, tea found a new home. The earliest introduction of tea to Japan is often traced to Buddhist monks who traveled to China during the Tenzing, and later the Song dynasties. These monks studied Chinese Chan Buddhism, which emphasized meditation, discipline, and simplicity. They observed that Chinese monks used tea as a tool. The gentle bitterness helped them stay awake during long hours of meditation. Returning to Japan, these monks brought with them both the leaves and the practice. One monk in particular, Isai, is remembered for his role in spreading tea. In the late 12th century, he wrote a small but influential book called Kisa Yok, which translates as Drinking Tea for Health. In it, he praised tea not only as a spiritual aid, but as a medicine, describing its ability to support the heart, sharpen the mind, and extend life. His words framed tea as both sacred and practical, weaving it into the rhythms of Japanese life. In those early days, tea was prepared much like in Song dynasty China. Powdered green tea, kade matcha, was whisked into hot water, creating a frothy, vivid green drink. This method, simple yet elegant, suited the monastic practice. A bowl of matcha was not only nourishment but also a moment of focus, a pause in which body, mind, and spirit could align. Over time, however, Japan shaped tea into something distinct, something uniquely its own. Out of this blending of spirituality and daily life, the Japanese tea ceremony was born, known as Kanoyu Chado, or the Way of Tea. This ceremony transformed tea from a mere drink into an art form, a philosophy, and a path of inner stillness. The tea ceremony grew slowly, reaching maturity in the 5th, 10th, and 16th centuries. Guided by masters such as Sen no Riki, his teachings emphasized wabi-sabi, the beauty of simplicity, imperfection, and transience. To prepare tea then was not to show wealth or extravagance, but to embrace quietness, humility, and presence. Let us picture the scene. A small tea house, its entrance deliberately low, so that all who entered, whether noble or commoner, must bow. Inside, the space is plain, with muted colors, bare walls, and perhaps a single flower in a vase, carefully chosen. The host moves with deliberate grace, each gesture refined and practiced, folding the cloth, handling the ladle, whisking the tea. Guests sit quietly, observing, not rushing, the sound of water, the touch of bamboo against ceramic, the rising steam. All of these become part of the ceremony. In this way, tea became a meditation in itself. To drink tea was to be present in the moment, to recognize the fleeting nature of life, and to honor simplicity. Unlike the bustling trade of the Silk Road or the feasts of emperors, here tea whispered softly, reminding those who sipped it of stillness. The Japanese tea ceremony also embodied deep values of respect and equality. By bowing at the entrance, by kneeling together on the same level, participants symbolically set aside differences of rank. For a short while, lord and servant shared the same bowl of tea, in the same quiet room, with the same attention. It was a radical simplicity, teaching that in the presence of tea, all were equal. The tools of the ceremony, the tea bowl, the whisk, the kettle, were treated with reverence. They were not extravagant treasures, but chosen with care. Often handmade, their imperfections cherished as signs of authenticity. A rough, uneven glaze on a tea bowl could be seen as more beautiful than flawless porcelain, because it spoke of nature, of human touch, of seasonality too, was woven into the practice. The flowers chosen for decoration, the scroll displayed in the alcove, even the type of sweets served with tea, all reflected the passing moment in the year. To drink tea in spring was different from drinking it in autumn. Each ceremony was unique, never to be repeated, like a single breath or a single snowfall. In this way, tea in Japan became more than a beverage. It became a philosophy of life. A bowl of matcha was a world in miniature. Silence, respect, harmony, purity, and tranquility. Beyond the tea house, tea culture spread into the broader society. Samurai lords sponsored tea gatherings. Scholars wrote about the philosophy of tea, and artisans devoted themselves to crafting the finest tools. Tea gardens were designed to lead guests along winding paths, preparing their hearts for the quiet simplicity of the tea room. In etched detail, tea shaped the rhythms of Japanese life. Even today, the echoes of this tradition remain. A modern tea ceremony, whether in a small hut or a school hall, carries the same sense of quiet. The host moves slowly, the guests observe respectfully, and together they share a single bowl of tea as though it were the whole universe. When we pause to consider this, we see how far tea had traveled, from the mountains of China to the islands of Japan, from the hands of Buddhist monks to the art of entire generations. And in that journey, it carried not only leaves, but lessons about patience, about humility, about finding beauty in the small and the fleeting. As you rest now, imagine yourself seated in that tea house, the soft crackle of the kettle filling the silence. The tea is whisked, the froth rises, and the bowl is placed before you with two hands, a gesture of respect. You lift it, sip slowly, and in that quiet taste, the world becomes calm. As we move forward in time, let us step softly into another chapter of tea's story, one shaped by empires that stretched across vast lands, and by journeys that carried tea into unexpected regions. The Mongol era, with its immense conquests and its blending of cultures, was a bridge between East and West. And in this bridge, tea found new paths to travel. The Yuan dynasty in China, established by Kublai Khan in the late 13th century, represented a time of great movement. The Mongols, horsemen of the steppe, were not originally tea drinkers. Their traditional diet revolved around meat, dairy, and fermented drinks. Tea, with its delicate leaves and subtle flavors, was far from the world of the saddle. Yet the Mongols, once rulers of China, adapted and absorbed much from the cultures they conquered. Tea, already embedded in Chinese society, became part of this new imperial court. Kublai Khan himself is said to have enjoyed tea, though perhaps more as a symbol of rulership than as a daily ritual. For the Mongols, the ability to command the treasures of China, silk, porcelain, spices, and tea, was part of their assertion of power. At court, tea was offered to guests as a sign of hospitality, a mark of the empire's wealth and refinement. But beyond the palace walls, tea began to take on a new role. On the steppes, where the Mongol armies camped, tea was consumed differently. Often, it was boiled with milk, and sometimes with butter, creating a hearty, sustaining drink more suited to the harsh climate and the nomadic life. This practice would echo later in the butter teas of Tibet and Mongolia, where tea leaves are churned with yak butter and salt, producing a rich, warming beverage that provides both energy and comfort. In these adaptations, we see how tea bent to the needs of each land, becoming not only a luxury, but also a source of nourishment. The Mongol Empire stretched across Eurasia, connecting lands that had once been far apart. Through the Pax Mongolica, or Mongol peace, trade routes became safer and more reliable. Caravans traveled from China through Central Asia and into Persia, the Middle East, and even Europe. With them went tea. It was during this period that the idea of tea first reached lands far beyond its origin. While it would take centuries for tea to fully root itself in Europe, the Mongol highways were the beginning of that journey. One of the regions most influenced by this expansion was Russia. By the 16th and 17th centuries, long after the fall of the Yuan dynasty, trade between China and Russia flourished. Across Siberia, caravans, laden with bricks of tea, made their way into Moscow and beyond. Imagine a long caravan trudging through snowy forests, sledges creaking under the weight of tightly packed tea, bound together in compressed bricks for ease of transport. These bricks were not only valuable as trade goods, but were sometimes used as currency themselves, each pressed square stamped with marks of authenticity. In Russia, tea found eager acceptance. At first, it was a luxury enjoyed by nobles and merchants, but soon it spread into wider society. Russians, accustomed to hot beverages to endure the cold, took naturally to tea. They developed their own traditions, including the famous samovar, a tall, ornate metal vessel that kept water boiling for tea throughout the day. The samovar became a centerpiece of Russian households, its gentle bubbling a constant background sound, its warmth both physical and social. Tea gatherings in Russia became moments of connection. Families sat together, pouring tea into glasses held in metal holders, sweetening it with sugar or jam, and conversing by the glow of the smoke. In this way, tea in Russia came to symbolize hospitality and comfort. A guest offered tea was a guest welcomed with open arms. This Russian embrace of tea was not without difficulty. The journey from China across Siberia could take many months, even years. The caravans faced snowstorms, rivers, and the long silence of frozen landscapes. Yet despite the hardship, the demand for tea only grew. Over time, routes improved, and tea became a staple of Russian life, spreading from Moscow to St. Petersburg and eventually across the vast empire. Thus, through the Mongols and their successors, tea extended its reach into new worlds. From the Butta tea of the Tibetan plateau to the samovar gatherings of Russia, it adapted, changed, and yet retained its essence. A drink of leaves steeped in hot water, yet capable of taking on countless forms. It is worth pausing here to consider how remarkable this journey was. From small leaves growing in the misty hills of China, tea had crossed seas, mountains, and deserts. It had entered monasteries, palaces, and nomadic tents. It had been whisked into froth in Japan, churned with butter in Tibet, and poured from samovars in Russia. Each culture made tea its own, and yet in each place, tea became associated with warmth, connection, and ritual. As you rest, picture these scenes unfolding across time. A Mongol warrior sipping butter tea by the fire, the steam rising into the cold steppe night. A Russian family gathered around a glowing samovar, the clinking of glasses and the sweetness of jam dissolving in hot tea. Across centuries and continents, tea brought a thread of comfort, weaving together lives that might otherwise never have touched. And so, tea continued its quiet expansion, preparing to take its most dramatic step yet, its entry into Europe, and eventually into the hearts and cups of Britain. That story, too, would be long, complex, and filled with both elegance and conflict. By the time tea had traveled with caravans into Russia and across the Mongol highways, another pathway was opening for its journey. The sea, the early modern world, was an age of ships, sails, and exploration. As European powers ventured across oceans in search of spices, silks, and other treasures, they inevitably encountered tea. What had begun as a regional tradition in Asia was now poised to become a global phenomenon. It was the Portuguese who first made contact with tea in China during the early 16th century. Traders and missionaries alike wrote about the strange but refreshing beverage they encountered in Chinese courts and markets. To them, tea was exotic, an emblem of the mysterious East. Jesuit missionaries, always keen observers of culture, described not only the taste of tea, but also the rituals surrounding it. Through their letters, the idea of tea began to trickle back into Europe. But it was the Dutch who took the crucial step of importing tea in quantity. In the early 17th century, the Dutch East India Company began shipping tea from China to Europe. At first, it was a rare and costly luxury, available only to the wealthy. A small canister of tea could fetch a high price in Amsterdam, Paris, or London. It was sold in apothecaries as both a drink and a medicine, believed to cleanse the body and sharpen the mind. The taste of tea was unlike anything Europeans had known. Coffee and chocolate, too, were arriving from abroad during this period, and the three beverages would become rivals and companions in shaping European tastes. Tea, with its subtle bitterness and calming warmth, offered something unique. Aristocrats and intellectuals sipped it as a novelty, often in tiny porcelain cups, imported alongside the leaves. By the mid-17th century, tea reached England. The earliest known mention of tea in Britain appeared in a London newspaper advertisement from 1658, offering cha by the China drink. A few years later, tea gained a powerful patron, Catherine of Bourgogne, a Portuguese princess who married King Charles II of England in 1662. Catherine was a devoted tea drinker, and her habits soon influenced the English court. What began as a queen's personal preference spread among the nobility, then into the fashionable circles of London. At first, tea was considered an elite indulgence, served in dainty porcelain cups, often sweetened with sugar from the colonies. It was both a statement of refinement and of wealth. Tea was expensive, and so too were the accessories required to enjoy it properly. Teapots, cups, saucers, and caddies for storing the precious leaves. To be seen drinking tea was to signal sophistication, cosmopolitan taste, and connection to the wider world. Over time, however, tea became more accessible. The growth of trade, especially through the British East India Company, ensured that tea flowed steadily into England. Prices slowly fell, though never so low as to strip tea of its air of elegance. By the early 18th century, tea was no longer just the drink of aristocrats. Merchants, shopkeepers, and even some laborers began to enjoy it. Tea houses opened in London, offering a space where men could drink tea, read newspapers, and discuss business or politics. These establishments were quieter and less raucous than the ale, and they soon developed reputations as respectable meeting places. Women, too, found in tea a new social ritual. Unlike coffee houses, which often excluded women, tea could be enjoyed at home or in mixed company. Afternoon tea gatherings became opportunities for conversation, for displaying one's manners, and for strengthening social ties. The very act of serving tea, carefully pouring the hot water, arranging cups on a tray, offering sugar and perhaps cakes, became a performance of hospitality and grace. In time, these rituals would evolve into the formal tradition of afternoon tea, so strongly associated with British culture. Of course, tea's rise in Britain was not without its darker side. The growing demand for tea fueled imperial expansion and exploitation. To sweeten their tea, Britons relied on sugar plantations in the Caribbean, worked by enslaved Africans. To secure supplies of tea itself, the East India Company wielded enormous power in Asia, shaping trade and politics alike. The simple act of sipping tea in a London parlour was tied, often invisibly, to a vast and often brutal global system. Yet for those drinking it, tea remained above all a source of comfort and social. Writers of the period often remarked on the charm of the tea table. The philosopher Samuel Johnson was said to drink tea in prodigious quantities, claiming that it was his solace and refreshment. For others, tea was a companion to reading, to writing, to quiet evenings at home. As the 18th century progressed, tea became firmly rooted in British life. Imports soared and smuggling became widespread as people sought to avoid heavy taxes on legal shipments. Along the coasts of England, clandestine tea arrived in barrels and bales, hidden in caves or cellars until it could be sold. For many families, smuggled tea was the only affordable option. Even so, the desire for tea was so strong that demand never waned. By the end of the 18th century, tea was more than just a drink in Britain. It was a national habit, a daily necessity for rich and poor alike. The teapot had found a permanent place on the hearth, and the image of a family gathered around it became a symbol of domestic harmony. Tea was no longer foreign. It had become, in a sense, British. This transformation marked a turning point in the history of tea. What had once been a rare and mysterious leaf from distant hills was now a central part of one nation's culture. But the story was far from over. In the next chapters, tea would stir revolutions, reshape trade, and inspire new rituals that would carry it even further into the world. For now, imagine yourself in a quiet London parlour in the 18th century. The fire is warm, the porcelain cups gleam in the candlelight, and the gentle aroma of tea fills the air. Outside, the city hums with commerce and chatter. But within these walls, the act of sipping tea brings a sense of calm and connection. Across oceans, across centuries, tea had found yet another home. By the 18th century, tea had ceased to be merely a curiosity in Britain. It was now a daily necessity, a cultural centerpiece, and an economic force. But this beloved beverage was no simple pleasure. Behind each cup lay a vast network of trade, taxation, and empire. Tea became more than a drink. It became a symbol of power, of resistance, and of the far-reaching consequences of global commerce. Let us begin with Britain's relationship to China. For centuries, China had carefully managed foreign trade. Tea, silk, and porcelain were exchanged for silver. But Chinese rulers resisted European demands for broader access to their markets. The British thirst for tea grew ever larger, and silver flowed steadily eastward. By the mid-18th century, this imbalance worried British officials. They sought other goods that could be traded for tea, but few products held much appeal for Chinese buyers. The answer, tragically, was opium. Grown in British-controlled India, opium was smuggled into China in increasing quantities, creating widespread addiction and devastation. As opium flowed in, silver once again flowed out, this time from China to Britain. In return, tea continued to pour into London docks, filling warehouses and households alike. The cycle of addiction and trade set the stage for conflict. The The Opium Wars of the 19th century were, in part, wars for tea. Britain, determined to maintain its profitable trade, fought to force China into compliance. The resulting treaties opened Chinese ports, ceded Hong Kong, and reshaped the balance of power in Asia. All of this, at its root, was linked to the humble belief in the teacup. Across the Atlantic, tea had already played its part in another great upheaval. In the American colonies, resentment over taxation brewed alongside the tea itself. The Tea Act of 1773, intended to rescue the struggling East India Company by granting it monopoly rights, sparked outrage. Colonists saw it as an attempt to impose control without representation. In Boston Harbor, protesters, disguised as Mohawk Indians, boarded ships and tossed crates of tea into the water. The Boston Tea Party became one of the most iconic acts of defiance in American history. The irony was that many colonists actually loved tea, yet in their rebellion, they turned away from it, embracing coffee as a patriotic alternative. Even today, the United States remains a nation more associated with coffee than tea, though the influence of that colonial moment has softened with time. Still, it reminds us how a simple drink can become a symbol of identity, loyalty, and resistance. Meanwhile, within Britain itself, tea was entwined with another vast enterprise. The sugar trade. Sweetened tea became the national drink, but the sugar that flavored it came at a terrible cost. On Caribbean plantations, enslaved Africans labored under brutal conditions to produce the sugar consumed in British homes. Every teaspoon stirred into a cup represented not just sweetness, but also suffering. As the 19th century advanced, tea cultivation began to spread beyond China. The British, eager to reduce reliance on Chinese imports, turned their gaze to India. In the Assam region, wild tea plants had been discovered. The East India Company launched experiments, eventually developing large plantations. Later, in Darjeeling, high in the Himalayan foothills, more tea gardens were established. Sri Lanka, too, became a center of tea production after coffee crops. They were devastated by disease. These plantations marked a new chapter in tea's history. No longer dependent on Chinese supply, the British could now produce their own tea within their empire. The labor, however, was often harsh. Workers, drawn from local populations or imported under indenture, faced grueling conditions. Plantations were systems of control as much as cultivation, yet they ensured that tea would remain plentiful and affordable for Britain's growing population. At home, tea had become a defining feature of daily life. The Victorian era, with its emphasis on order, propriety, and family, elevated tea into a ritual of domesticity. The image of a household gathered around the tea table became a symbol of moral respectability. Tea was seen not only as a drink, but as a civilizing force, a way to encourage temperance and gentility. In industrial cities, where workers endured long hours and harsh conditions, tea offered warmth, energy, and a brief respite from labor. Philanthropists and reformers often promoted tea as a healthier alternative to alcohol. In an age of temperance movements, the teacup stood in opposition to the beer mug. A worker who drank tea was considered steady, industrious, and respectable. Thus, tea was not merely consumed. It was moralized, tied to values of sobriety, discipline, and family virtue. The ritual of afternoon tea, popularized by Anna, Duchess of Bedford in the early 19th century, added another layer, finding the gap between lunch and late dinner too long. She began inviting friends to share tea with bread, butter, and cakes in the afternoon. The practice spread quickly among the fashionable classes, evolving into a cherished social tradition. Afternoon tea, with its tiered trays and delicate cups, embodied refinement and leisure. It was tea as performance, as theater of manners. At the same time, in humbler homes, tea remained a comfort rather than a spectacle. A pot of strong black tea, sweetened with sugar and softened with milk, became the fuel of the working class. For miners, factory hands, and servants, tea was both nourishment and solace. It was cheap, it was quick, and it was endlessly adaptable. The same leaves that graced elegant drawing rooms also simmered in chipped mugs beside factory gates. By the mid-19th century, tea had truly become the drink of the British nation. It was present in every class, every region, every hour of the day. And yet, behind this ubiquity lay the shadows of empire, conflict, and exploitation. Tea was global in its reach, but also deeply local in its meaning. Each cup contained both comfort and complexity. So, as you rest, imagine yourself drifting between these layers, The clink of porcelain in a London parlor, the cries of protests at Boston Harbor, the vast plantations of Assam, green leaves glistening under the sun, the slow bubbling of a samovar in a Russian home. Across the world, tea had become more than a beverage. It was a mirror of history itself. By the mid-19th century, tea was no longer simply a beverage. It had become woven into the very fabric of daily life. In Victorian Britain, a cup of tea could signify comfort, order, hospitality, and social rank all at once. To understand the role tea played in this era is to understand how a drink can become a ritual, a marker of identity, and even a reflection of society's values. Let us step into a typical Victorian home. Imagine a parlor bathed in soft lamplight, its furniture heavy with carved wood, draped with patterned fabrics. The hearth glows warmly, while a small table is set with cups and saucers, a polished teapot, and perhaps a plate of biscuits. The arrival of tea in such a space was not accidental. It was carefully arranged, a centerpiece of domestic order. Tea drinking had begun centuries earlier in China as a meditative practice, but in Britain, it took on a different character. Here it became bound up with domestic respectability. For Victorian women, especially, tea service was a way to demonstrate refinement. To pour tea properly, to offer it graciously, was to fulfill one's role as hostess, wife, or mother. Guests were received with a cup. Friends were welcomed over it. Family bonds were reaffirmed with each pot shared. The etiquette surrounding tea was exacting. Spoons were never to be left clinking in cups, but rested quietly on saucers, sugar tongs, nut fingers, lifted cubes into waiting cups. Milk could be added before or after the tea, but debate over the proper order lingered, hinting at class distinctions. To stir one's tea noisily was a small but telling breach of manners. Even such a simple act as sipping could carry social weight. Afternoon tea, already popularized by Anna Duchess of Bedford, grew into a full-fledged social institution. It was more than a meal. It was a performance of elegance. The table might be laid with tiered trays of sandwiches, scones, and pastries. Napkins were folded neatly, and the finest china brought out for display. In genteel households, this ritual served as both nourishment and spectacle, a chance to present one's refinement to visitors. Meanwhile, the working classes had their own forms of tea rituals. Theirs were less elaborate, but no less significant. A strong brew poured into sturdy mugs, softened with milk and heaped with sugar, sustained laborers through long hours. The act of pausing for tea, even briefly, offered a moment of comfort amid the noise of factories and the dust of coal mines. For the poor, tea was not luxury but necessity, an affordable source of warmth and energy. This duality was striking. The same leaves, prepared differently, served both duchess and dock worker. Tea blurred class lines, even as it reinforced them. It was democratic in its spread, yet stratified in its forms. The poor drank from chipped mugs, the wealthy from porcelain cups gilded in gold. But in each case, tea provided connection to one's family, to one's community, to the rhythms of daily life. Beyond the home, tea houses and tea rooms began to flourish. By the later Victorian period, urban centers boasted establishments where women could gather respectably outside the home. These tea rooms became important social spaces, allowing women independence in public life without the stigma of taverns or public houses. A pot of tea, poured in a quiet tea room, could represent freedom as well as refreshment. At the same time, tea was increasingly tied to industry and commerce. Packaged blends, sold in recognizable brands, spread through shops and markets. Companies like Twinings and Lipton rose to prominence, shaping consumer habits and marketing tea as both exotic and familiar. Advertisements depicted happy families, industrious workers, and elegant ladies, all united by their shared enjoyment of tea. The Victorian obsession with order extended to tea preparation itself. Specialized equipment proliferated: ornate silver teapots, delicate cups, decorative strainers, and polished trays. Each item reflected not only functionality, but also status. A well-equipped tea table was a sign of prosperity, a marker of belonging to a refined household. Yet tea was more than appearance. It was also comfort, ritual, and rhythm. Morning tea might wake a household. Afternoon tea provided pause. Evening tea calmed before bed. Across the hours, tea structured the day, creating moments of stillness amid the noise of industrial life. Literature of the period reveals tea's symbolic power. In countless novels, the act of serving or sharing tea stands as a backdrop to conversation, to confession, to quiet reflection. It is a stage upon which relationships unfold, where bonds are strengthened, and where subtle social judgments are made. To refuse tea could be impolite. To accept it was to join in the dance of civility. As the empire grew, tea was presented as a gift of Britain to the world. The reality, of course, was more complex. Plantations in India and Ceylon depended on exploited labor, and global conflicts were fought to secure trade. But in the British imagination, tea was both a symbol of empire and of home. A soldier in India, a clerk in London, a miner in Wales, all might drink tea and feel connected to the same tradition. One cannot overlook the moral overtones assigned to tea in Victorian discourse. Reformers praised it as a wholesome alternative to alcohol, aligning it with sobriety and discipline. To drink tea was to participate in respectability. To decline it in favor of gin or beer was to court suspicion. In this way, tea became more than a beverage. It became a quiet tool of moral persuasion, an emblem of social order. The Victorians also loved innovation, and tea was not untouched by this spirit. Tea clippers, sleek, fast-sailing ships, raced across oceans to deliver fresh cargoes. Their speed became legendary, and the first arrival of the season's tea was celebrated almost like a sporting victory. Newspapers reported on these races, and merchants promoted the freshness of their stock. Thus, even at sea, tea shaped excitement and identity. By the end of the 19th century, tea had become indispensable. To imagine a British home without it was nearly unthinkable. It had transcended its status as an exotic luxury and become instead a defining element of daily life, a ritual so ingrained that it seemed eternal. And so, as you drift toward rest, imagine yourself in a Victorian parlor. The air is faintly scented with roses. A clock ticks softly on the mantelpiece. A silver teapot gleams in the lamplight, steam curling gently from its spout. Cups are filled, spoons stir quietly, voices murmur in the background. This is not just a moment of refreshment. It is a ceremony of comfort, order, and belonging. The Victorian era was not only an age of etiquette and empire, it was also a time of rapid technological transformation. And tea, like nearly every aspect of daily life, was deeply affected by these changes. To trace the path of tea through the 19th century is to see how technology reshaped its production, transportation, preparation, and even the way it was imagined in the public mind. Let us begin with the tea clippers. Before steamships dominated the seas, these sailing vessels represented the height of maritime engineering. Their sleek hulls, tall masts, and billowing sails allowed them to cut across oceans with astonishing speed. They carried precious cargo, the first teas of the season from China. Victorians waited eagerly for their arrival, and newspapers tracked their journeys as though they were sporting contests. Merchants advertised the freshness of their stock, while consumers delighted in knowing they held the newest leaves. A cup of tea became, in a sense, a sip of technological triumph. Yet progress did not stop there. Steam power soon overtook the clippers, making voyages faster and more reliable. The opening of the Suez Canal in 1869 further shortened the route from Asia to Europe. What once took months could now take weeks. The tea that arrived in British ports was fresher, more plentiful, and more affordable. Industrial efficiency was poured into every cup. Technology also touched the production site. In India and Ceylon, where the British established vast plantations, machinery was introduced to aid in processing. While early tea was hand-rolled and sun-dried, new mechanical rollers and dryers increased output. This mechanization allowed for consistency and scale, qualities that suited an industrial nation eager for mass consumption. The cup of tea in the Victorian kitchen was no longer the result of artisanal craft alone. It was shaped by machines, by engines, by the pulse of industry. Packaging, too, was revolutionized. Tea was once sold loose, measured by the scoop from wooden chests, but industrial production enabled branded packages to emerge. Companies began sealing tea in tins and paper packets, each marked with familiar names and logos. Twinings, Lipton, and others became household brands, their identities tied not only to quality, but also to reliability. Consumers knew what they were buying, and trust in these brands deepened the bond between daily life and global commerce. Advertisements played their role as well. Illustrated posters, bold lettering, and catchy slogans presented tea as a universal good. Families were depicted gathered around the tea table. Industrious workers paused to refresh themselves with a cup. In every scene, tea was shown as clean, wholesome, and necessary. The subtle suggestion was clear. To drink tea was to be modern, respectable, and part of the great industrial nation. Domestic technology also reshaped how tea was prepared. Kettles evolved, stoves became more efficient, and teapots were designed for better pouring and heat retention. Silver-plated sets were produced in bulk, making them more accessible to the middle classes. Innovations like the spirit lamp and the tea cozy reflected the Victorian desire for order and efficiency in even the smallest details. The tea table became a miniature showcase of industrial craft. The industrial age also reshaped time itself, and with it, the rituals of tea, the factory whistle, the railway timetable, the office clock, all imposed new rhythms on daily life. Tea breaks emerged as a structured pause within this regimented time. For workers, a strong, sweet brew provided energy and comfort. For clerks and managers, tea punctuated the office day. The beverage adapted seamlessly to this new world of schedules and shifts. Railways extended tea's reach even further. Trains carried chests of tea inland from ports, ensuring supply even in distant towns. At stations, tea rooms opened to serve travelers. A weary passenger could rest with a cup before continuing on. The railway carriage itself became a site of tea drinking, with refreshments offered on longer journeys. Thus, tea accompanied Victorians not only at home but on the move, woven into the new culture of travel. The industrial city itself was fertile ground for tea's growth. In smoky, crowded streets, tea offered a sense of cleanliness and order. Reformers praised it as a temperance drink, steering workers away from alcohol. Charitable organizations provided tea at gatherings, emphasizing its moral superiority. In homes where gin had once dominated, the kettle began to claim pride of place. The industrial age, with its challenges and hardships, found solace in a simple cup of tea. In literature and popular writing, tea was often depicted as the great stabilizer. Amid the pace of change, it represented continuity. No matter how swiftly factories churned or how loudly trains roared, tea provided a moment of stillness. Writers captured its reassuring presence. A teapot on the hearth, a cup in the hand, a conversation unfolding quietly. This symbolism became a cultural anchor, linking the mechanical world to the human need for calm. Tea also connected to health in the Victorian imagination. Physicians wrote about its digestive benefits, its ability to soothe nerves, and its role in maintaining sobriety. Pamphlets encouraged its use over stronger drinks, framing it as almost medicinal. While some voices worried about overindulgence or caffeine, the prevailing views celebrated tea as a moral, healthful choice for an industrious population. Even in the colonies, tea mirrored industrial order. Plantations were organized with strict routines, echoing the regimentation of factories. Workers, often under harsh conditions, picked leaves in patterns designed for efficiency. The same industrial spirit that powered engines and mills was imposed upon distant fields. And so, the cup of tea in a London parlor was bound invisibly to the labor of thousands far away, their toil hidden behind the polished surface of civilization. As the century drew to a close, tea had fully merged with the identity of industrial Britain. It was not merely a remnant of the past or a luxury of the elite. It was the drink of the worker, the traveler, the hostess, the reformer, the soldier. Industrialization had not diminished tea as ritual. It had expanded it, embedding it into every corner of life. Imagine, then, the hum of a Victorian city at dusk. The whistle of a departing train echoes in the distance. A lamplighter moves steadily down the street. Behind curtained windows, kettles whistle and teapots are filled. Cups clink gently against saucers. In the midst of the industrial roar, tea offers quiet, order, and warmth. By the late 19th century, tea was no longer simply a commodity or a household ritual. It had become a symbol of empire itself, stretching its influence from the misty hills of Asia to the drawing rooms of London, from plantation fields to ocean-spanning trade routes. To understand tea in this period is to understand how a single leaf became bound to the story of global power, commerce, and culture. Let us begin in India, where British planters had established vast estates to cultivate tea. The story of these plantations is one of both ambition and hardship. Hillsides in Assam and Darjeeling were cleared, seeds were planted, and workers were brought in to tend the fields. The climate was hot, the work relentless. Entire communities labored from dawn until dusk, plucking delicate leaves that would eventually make their way to Britain. Darjeeling, with its cooler air and higher altitude, produced a tea so delicate that it earned the nickname the champagne of teas. By contrast, yielded strong Malta leaves that blended perfectly for breakfast brews. Together, they gave Britain its signature teas, shaping blends like English breakfast that became household staples. Yet behind every cup lay the toil of workers whose names are mostly forgotten, their labor feeding the insatiable appetite of an empire. Ceylon, known today as Sri Lanka, became another vital center. After the island's coffee crops were devastated by disease, British planters turned to tea in the mid-19th century. The gamble succeeded. Within decades, Ceylon became one of the world's leading producers, its teas famed for their bright and lively flavor. The name Ceylon tea remains a mark of distinction even today, a reminder of this colonial transformation. Tea was not simply a crop, it was an instrument of global strategy. Control of tea production meant control of markets, profits, and prestige. The East India Company had once monopolized the trade, but by the later 19th century, competition had grown fierce. Private firms, brand names, and international traders all vied for dominance. The empire's arteries carried tea, as surely as they carried textiles, coal, and steel. On the consumer side, tea continued to bind society together. In Britain, it was no longer confined to the wealthy. Industrial wages, improved transport, and mass production meant that even working families could afford their daily brew. Tea became a unifying habit, bridging class divides, whether in a country estate or a crowded factory town. The sight of a steaming teapot was familiar. The empire, however, ensured that this habit echoed far beyond Britain. In Australia, settlers carried the tea custom with them, establishing it as a household essential. In New Zealand, tea tables became central to hospitality, with guests invariably offered a cup. Across Canada, tea remained a symbol of British identity, even as coffee gained influence from the United States. In every corner of the empire, tea signified belonging to family, to community, and to the imperial whole. Yet not all was harmony. The tea trade carried shadows of exploitation and inequality. Plantation workers, often bound by strict contracts, faced harsh conditions. Wages were low, hours long, and freedoms limited. The wealth generated from their labor flowed outward into the banks of London, the pockets of merchants, the dividends of shareholders. The comforting drink in a British parlor was tied, invisibly but firmly, to struggles in distant lands. At the same time, tea was woven into the empire's image of itself. Colonial exhibitions displayed towering models of tea plants, alongside samples of leaves from different regions. Posters and advertisements linked tea to the idea of civilization: neat, orderly, refined. In this way, the empire presented tea not only as a product, but as proof of its supposed mission to bring order and cultivation to the world. The social rituals of tea spread outward as well. Afternoon tea, codified in Britain, was adopted in colonial outposts. Governors' houses echoed with clinking china. Mission stations served tea to visitors. Railway hotels provided travelers with the same ritual comforts they would expect in London. Even in far-flung lands, the performance of tea reinforced imperial connection. Russia, too, remained an important player. The caravans across Siberia gave way, by the late 19th century, to rail transport. The Trans-Siberian Railway carried tea with greater speed and efficiency, ensuring a steady flow into Russian markets. The samovar continued to stand as a cultural symbol, linking Russian identity with tea's warmth and hospitality. Meanwhile, in America, tea's story took a different turn. After the Boston Tea Party, coffee had gained ground as the patriotic choice. Yet tea never disappeared entirely. In the southern states, it transformed into something distinct: iced tea. By the late 19th century, recipes for cold, sweetened tea appeared in cookbooks, laying the foundation for what would become a quintessential American drink in the decades to follow. As the empire reached its zenith, tea's presence was unmistakable. It was served in military barracks, in naval ships, in colonial offices, in rural cottages, and in grand urban hotels. It was consumed at breakfast, at afternoon gatherings, and during evening conversations. In times of celebration and in moments of sorrow, the teapot was placed upon the table. And so, tea was more than a drink. It was a symbol of empire's reach, a thread that tied together the lives of rulers and subjects, of merchants and workers, of colonists and colonists. Each cup contained not only leaves and water, but history of conquests, of trade, of adaptation, of human connection across vast distances. Pause here and imagine the world at that time. Ships in distant harbors unloading crates of tea, onto bustling docks, workers on plantations plucking leaves under the hot sun, a London hostess arranging her tea service with careful precision, a family in New Zealand passing a teacup around the table, a Russian traveler pouring steaming liquid from across continents. The same ritual unfolded, linked by invisible threads of commerce and empire. The 19th century then was tea's global moment. A time when it reached every corner of the world, shaped by power and technology, yet always remaining a quiet comfort in the hands of those who drank it. As the 19th century drew to a close and the 20th century began, tea had already secured its place as one of the world's most beloved drinks. But history was not yet finished shaping it. The modern era would bring wars, revolutions, innovations, and globalization, all of which would leave their mark on the humble teacup. Let us begin with the First World War. The trenches of Europe were grim places, filled with mud, fear, and exhaustion. Yet even there, soldiers clung to the comfort of tea. In the British Army, tea was part of the daily ration. Enamel mugs of hot liquid were carried to weary men as they huddled in dugouts. It was more than warmth. It was a reminder of home, a moment of calm amidst chaos. Soldiers joked that tea had kept the empire fighting as much as bullets and rations did. The interwar years saw tea continue to flourish. Tea houses multiplied, especially for women, offering spaces where they could gather socially outside the home. Advertising became more sophisticated, linking tea to modern lifestyles. Posters showed smiling families, athletes, and workers refreshed by their daily brew. Brand names such as Lipton, Brook Bond, and Twinings solidified their identities, reaching audiences through radio jingles and colorful packaging. Then came the Second World War. Once again, tea was a lifeline. In Britain, rationing controlled almost everything, but the government made special efforts to ensure that tea remained available. Cargo ships carried tea across dangerous waters, patrolled by submarines. At times, entire convoys were dedicated to bringing tea to Britain. Officials feared that without it, morale would collapse. And so, in bomb shelters, in factories, in military camps, tea was brewed. Each cup carried resilience, courage, and the hope of endurance. After the war, as empires declined and nations sought independence, tea underwent another transformation. India, Sri Lanka, and other former colonies took charge of their own tea industries. Plantations continued to operate, but the profits and management shifted increasingly into local hands. Tea became not only a global commodity, but also a source of national pride. Darjeeling and Assam marketed themselves directly to the world, and Ceylon tea became a hallmark of quality. In China, tea had endured upheavals. The late Qing dynasty had fallen. Civil war and revolution had reshaped the nation, and yet the culture of tea persisted. Green teas, oolong teas, and pu'er teas retained their ancient associations, cherished in homes and tea houses alike. In the 20th century, China re-emerged as both a producer and a cultural guardian, reminding the world that tea's origins lay in its soil. Meanwhile, in Japan, the tea ceremony remained a revered practice, blending art, philosophy, and hospitality. Even as modern life accelerated, the careful ritual of preparing matcha continued to offer stillness. The bright green froth in a lacquered bowl stood in contrast to the noise of modern cities, a reminder of continuity in the midst of change. Elsewhere, tea adapted in unique ways. In the Middle East and North Africa, tea became infused with mint and sugar, served in small glasses, poured with elegance from shining teapots. In Turkey, strong black tea brewed in stacked kettles was poured into tulip-shaped glasses, a daily ritual as essential as bread. In Russia, the samovar remained, though electric versions replaced charcoal, continuing the tradition in modern homes. In Britain itself, tea culture shifted with changing times. Afternoon tea persisted in hotels and special gatherings, but daily life revolved more around a quick cuppa. Workplaces introduced tea breaks, institutionalizing the idea that workers should pause, rest, and refresh. The phrase tea break entered common speech, symbolizing a moment of respite in busy schedules. The rise of supermarkets and convenience foods altered tea as well. Tea bags, first introduced in the early 20th century, became widespread by mid-century. No longer was it necessary to measure loose leaves into a pot. A single bag could be dipped directly into a cup. Some lamented the loss of ritual, but many embraced the speed and simplicity. The tea bag made tea even more accessible, fitting seamlessly into the rhythm of modern life. By the late 20th century, tea had truly gone global. International brands reached into every corner of the world. At the same time, specialized markets flourished, offering fine single-origin teas to discerning drinkers. Herbal teas or tisans gained popularity, expanding the definition of what tea could mean. Chamomile, peppermint, rooibos, and countless other plants found their way into mugs alongside traditional leaves. In the United States, iced tea grew into a cultural icon, especially in the South. Sweet tea became a staple, served in tall glasses clinking with ice, refreshing in the summer heat. At the same time, specialty tea shops began to appear, introducing Americans to green teas, chai, and exotic blends. Coffee dominated, but tea quietly expanded its presence. As the 21st century began, tea was woven into global culture. It was no longer just a drink of empire or tradition. It was a universal companion. Offices stocked tea bags beside coffee machines. Cafes offered chai lattes and matcha smoothies. Health-conscious consumers rediscovered green tea's antioxidants and pu'era's digestive benefits. Tea had adapted once more, finding relevance in a modern age of wellness and diversity. And yet, despite these changes, something remained constant. The act of boiling water, of steeping leaves, of waiting as flavors unfold, this small ritual endured. In the quiet moment when a cup is lifted, when warmth is felt in the hands, when the first sip soothes throat and spirit, the history of tea is present. It whispers of Chinese monks, of Japanese gardens, of British parlors, of Indian hillsides, of African kitchens, of American porches. It is a bridge across centuries and continents. As you listen now, perhaps you can imagine yourself holding such a cup. The liquid dark and fragrant, steam rising gently into the air. Each sip carrying stories from long ago dynasties, empires, struggles, celebrations, daily lives lived and forgotten. Tea has accompanied humanity through wars and peace, through hardship and joy. It has been both luxury and necessity, ceremony and comfort. And so, as our journey across time concludes, let us rest in the knowledge that tea is not only history, but presence. It connects us to the past, and yet it lives with us in the present, in every quiet sip. From the mountains of China to the tables of today, tea remains a gentle constant, calming, sustaining, reminding us that even in a restless world, stillness can be found in something as simple as a cup.